They rejected a single data job interview until he fixed the CEO's biggest problem in seconds. Morning light reflected off the glass walls of the tallest corporate tower in the city, turning it into a symbol of power, ambition, and judgment. And among the dozens of people walking into its vast lobby that day was Daniel, a single father carrying more than just a resume in his worn leather folder. He adjusted his jacket slowly, not because it was uncomfortable, but because he knew appearances mattered in places like this. And even though his clothes were clean and neatly pressed, they carried the quiet honesty of a man who valued responsibility over luxury. As he approached the reception desk and gave his name, he could feel eyes lingering on him, quick glances filled with silent assumptions, the kind people make before a word is ever spoken. Other candidates sat nearby, polished shoes tapping lightly on the floor, confident smiles rehearsed. And Daniel sensed that he didn't quite belong in their world. Yet he remained still, grounding himself with the thought of his daughter, who had hugged him tightly that morning before school and asked if today was the day things would finally change. When the interview room door opened, he entered a sleek boardroom dominated by a long glass table, leather chairs, and a massive screen displaying charts and figures. And at the far end sat the CEO, composed and observant, her presence commanding the room without effort. The interview began formally. Questions about experience, skills, past projects. And Daniel answered each one calmly, clearly, drawing from years of hands-on problem-solving rather than polished corporate jargon. And for a brief moment, it felt like he was being seen for his abilities. Then the conversation shifted, as it often did, toward availability and personal circumstances. And when Daniel honestly stated that he was a single father, raising his daughter on his own, the atmosphere subtly changed. One board member leaned back. Another exchanged a glance. And a question followed about flexibility, about late nights and sudden travel, framed politely but weighted with doubt. Daniel tried to explain that responsibility had taught him discipline, efficiency, and focus, that every decision he made mattered because someone depended on him. But the words seemed to fall into a space already filled with assumptions. The CEO closed his file gently, not unkindly, but decisively, and thanked him for coming. A signal Daniel recognized all too well. He felt the familiar heaviness in his chest, the quiet resignation of a door closing yet again. And as he prepared to stand, the large screen behind the panel suddenly froze, numbers blurring and graphs shifting erratically. The room tensed instantly, voices overlapping as someone called for the technical team, and the CEO's calm expression sharpened with concern. Because this presentation was meant for investors later that day, Daniel's eyes were drawn back to the screen, his mind instinctively analyzing the pattern. And within seconds, he noticed what others hadn't: a small but critical formula misalignment causing cascading errors. He hesitated, aware that the interview was effectively over. But the instinct to fix what was broken overpowered his self-doubt. And he spoke up softly, suggesting the issue might be in the data linkage. His comment was initially dismissed, someone remarking that IT would handle it. But as minutes passed and no solution emerged, the tension thickened. Daniel took a breath and spoke again, this time clearer, asking if he could take a quick look. And a few people chuckled, surprised by his audacity. The CEO studied him for a long moment, weighing risk against desperation, then nodded once and said, "Let him try." Daniel stepped forward, fingers steady as he navigated the spreadsheet, scanning formulas, tracing references, and with a few precise adjustments corrected the error. The screen refreshed, the data aligned perfectly, and the graph stabilized as if nothing had ever gone wrong. And silence fell over the room. No one spoke for several seconds. The kind of silence filled not with awkwardness, but realization. As eyes turned toward Daniel with a mixture of surprise and reassessment, he stepped back quietly, returning to his place without celebration, unaware that in those brief moments he had shifted something far larger than a technical problem, planting the first crack in a wall built on assumptions and overlooked potential. The silence that followed. The corrected screen was not the awkward pause of uncertainty, but the heavy stillness of a room forced to reconsider what it thought it already understood. And Daniel felt it before anyone spoke. The subtle shift in posture, the recalculation behind steady expressions, the way eyes that had once skimmed past him now lingered with attention. The CEO slowly rose from her chair, not in dramatic astonishment, but with controlled curiosity, and asked him how he had identified the issue so quickly. And Daniel answered honestly, explaining that patterns had a way of revealing themselves when you learned to look beyond surface details. Something life had taught him long before spreadsheets ever did. He spoke calmly, without pride or defensiveness, and described how years of managing limited time, finances, and unexpected problems had trained his mind to search for root causes rather than visible symptoms. And as he spoke, the board members listened in a way they had not earlier, some nodding slightly, others folding their hands as if absorbing something uncomfortable yet undeniable. The CEO reopened his file and began asking questions again. This time, different ones, about his approach to pressure, decision-making, and accountability. And Daniel responded with quiet clarity, sharing examples not framed as achievements but as responsibilities. Moments when failure was not an option because someone else depended on him to get it right. The room no longer felt like a tribunal, but a space where understanding was cautiously being rebuilt, and Daniel noticed that no one interrupted him now. No one rushed his explanations or dismissed his perspective. One of the executives finally admitted that the error on the screen had been overlooked for days, costing the company both time and confidence. And Daniel simply replied that problems tended to grow when people were too afraid to question assumptions, a statement that landed more deeply than he intended. The CEO studied him again, this time without the professional distance she had maintained earlier, and asked about his daughter, not as a liability, but as a reality. And Daniel spoke of her with restrained warmth, explaining how every late night, every rejection, and every sacrifice was measured against the responsibility of shaping a future she could trust. There was no appeal for sympathy in his words, only truth. And that honesty lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. After a brief private exchange among the board members, the CEO turned back to him and said that while the interview had not started in his favor, it had ended with clarity. And she offered him a position not framed as charity or exception, but as recognition of value, emphasizing that the company needed minds that could remain steady under pressure rather than conform to outdated definitions of availability. Daniel accepted quietly, the weight in his chest lifting not in triumph but relief, knowing this opportunity represented stability rather than status. And as he gathered his folder to leave, several executives stood, some offering brief nods, others genuine handshakes, gestures that marked a shift from dismissal to respect. When Daniel stepped out of the boardroom and into the elevator, the doors closing softly behind him, the silence felt different now, no longer heavy but reflective. And as the elevator descended, he allowed himself a single deep breath, steadying the emotions he had held back all morning. Outside the building, the city continued as it always had, indifferent and moving. But Daniel felt altered by the realization that perseverance had finally met recognition, not because he demanded it, but because he remained prepared when the moment arrived. He pulled out his phone and sent a brief message home, simple and unembellished, carrying more meaning than any speech ever could. And as he walked toward the street, blending back into the rhythm of everyday life, he understood that the true victory was not proving others wrong, but refusing to let their assumptions define him. The experience lingered with him not as validation, but as a reminder that capability often hides beneath labels people are too quick to apply. And somewhere high above, in that glass-walled boardroom, a company had quietly learned the same lesson, one that would influence decisions long after the screen had gone dark and the meeting had ended.